Welcome everyone to the Los Angeles City College hosting of Queer Korea From War to K-Pop Zoom lecture by Dr. Todd Henry of UC San Diego History Department. In celebration of the LGBTQ History Month of October, we have decided to host this event at the LACC Korean program, also with the APIDA RESJ committee. Welcome everyone. I would like to introduce you to Professor Todd Henry. To repeat, he's a professor at the Department of History at UC San Diego, and he specializes in modern Korean history. And he's also the editor of the volume Queer Korea, which is published by Duke University. And I'm so glad you could all join us today. He will be presenting his talk for today in about 40 minutes thereafter. There'll be opportunity for Q&A. Thank you, and without further ado, please begin, Professor Todd Henry.
Great, thank you so much for the introduction. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you. You can write into the chat.
Everybody hear me okay?
Sounds good. Yeah, we can all
Great.
show our reactions.
Great. Well, it's nice to meet you all here. I'm happy to be here. I want to thank Professor Hong and her university for inviting me to give me this opportunity to present some of my ongoing research with you, and also to celebrate LGBT History Month with this talk about modern and contemporary Korea. So let me begin the talk. First, I would just like to say that, we're currently in the era of K-pop, and things are changing very quickly. Of course, I'm sure you've all noticed that Netflix and other platforms are inundated with aspects of Korean culture, whether it's Squid Games or other important movies and dramas that are quickly changing the way we think about Korea's present, but also allows us to rethink Korea's past. So if you find expressions of queerness in any form, whether it's same-sex sexuality or gender non-normativity or other kinds of features of South Korean society in K-pop, I want to try to show you today that that is part of a much longer history that dates back to at least the Korean War, if not earlier. And so I'd like to present you some examples from the research that I've been doing. You can already see on this first slide some of the materials that I have been using to excavate little-known histories of South Korea after the Korean War. Now, the histories that I'm going to trace, some of them will be familiar to you, and others will be unfamiliar to you. Some of them relate to the fact that, of course, Korea is not the US. It's not the part of the West, although it's had important relations to this part of the world, as well as other regional powers. But as you know, Korea during the 20th century experienced colonialism, national division, a war that separated the peninsula into two rival states. And so many of the histories that I'm going to show you track a slightly different kind of trajectory, maybe than the ones that you're used to seeing. For example, where you have foundational moments like the Stonewall riots or the Compton riots on this part of the United States, the LGBT movements that happened during the 70s and the 80s. During South Korea's history, the 70s and the 80s was a period of political authoritarianism. And so it was very difficult for Koreans to mobilize in political movements, formal political movements, but that doesn't mean that Koreans didn't have their own kind of politics and their own communities. So part of what I've been trying to do is to try to examine those distinct subcultures and how they led into what we see after South Korea reestablishes procedural democracy in the 1990s and develops now into this global power a power that is now producing K-pop, K-drama, K-food, and is exporting it overseas. So I hope you get a sense of this earlier history by thinking through these materials with me. So let me begin with the talk and see if I can get the PowerPoint going. So queer Korea in post-authoritarian times, this is what I meant by what happened after the 1990s when Korean students and labor activists brought a very firm democratic system back to South Korea after several decades of authoritarianism. So when I say post-authoritarian period, I primarily mean post-1980s, so the 1990s to the present, the last 30 years or so. And we can see some really important transformations that happened during this 30 years. So in the first decade, in the 1990s, we see the emergence for probably the first time of a very dynamic LGBT activist movement. There were gay groups, there were lesbian groups, transgender groups. There were also Koreans who had moved overseas in the diaspora and who created LGBT organizations in places like Los Angeles and New York. So this was not just a South Korea-based movement, but also extended to the various communities of the Korean diaspora overseas. After the late 1990s, South Korea went through something known as the IMF crisis, where the International Monetary Fund had to bail out the South Korean economy. This is actually the moment when many companies moved into the media industries. So this actually is the crisis of the late 1990s that's going to give us K-pop that becomes popular after the turn of the century. And in the most recent decade, partly in response to LGBT activism and also to the kinds of new forms of media that we see on TV, there's been something of a homophobic backlash. So I put over here on the slides on the left, this is a very famous South Korean activist. This is Kim Jo-kwang-soo, who from the 1990s was very involved in the gay men's human rights group. This is called Chingusai. And you can see a picture of him getting married to his boyfriend of many years. This happened in 2013. And of course, it wasn't officially recognized as a marriage because South Korea doesn't recognize same-sex marriage, but nonetheless, it was an important event to publicly host this wedding, at which you can see a member of this fundamentalist church who got up on the stage and held up this sign protesting the wedding, and actually members of his church or his organization threw human poop onto the stage. So it gives you a sense of this kind of confrontation that we have been seeing in the last decade or so. On the right, you might recognize this K-pop star. This is Holland, who has since leaving his group become a solo singer in his own right, making many important songs with LGBT themes. And I wanted to show you another instance of this homophobic backlash. This is a picture, I believe, from several months ago, or maybe it was late last year, in which he was attacked while walking through one of the gay districts in Seoul. And so it's just to give you a sense of some of the key historical moments in the last 30 years when under democracy, various activist groups have emerged. K-pop has emerged as a response to this global recession in the 2000s. And then we begin to see this homophobic backlash where, for example, at Pride festivals, you have the pro-LGBT festival and you have the anti-LGBT festival happening almost simultaneously. So quite a lot of action and activity over the last 30 years. Just to start the presentation, I wanted to present you with that. Now, obviously, I'm not Korean. I'm not ethnic Korean person, but I do have a long-standing connection to the subject matter. And so by way of introduction and to be very clear about what my position is and what relation I have to this material, I put a couple of images up here to show you what I've been doing to try to both document and support the movement that's been taking place in the last 30 years. So here's a picture of me from the early 2000s. You'll notice that I still have some hair on my head. I'll be 50 on Monday. So this is when I was probably in my late 20s. And this was attending one of the first LGBT Pride festivals. It's been going on for about 20 years now, started in the early 2000s. Again, in that period when LGBT activism was getting its start. Here's one of the protests that I went to in that same year. You can see a flag for Chingusai. This is the gay men's organization. And this is actually a protest of the second Iraq war that was happening in the early 2000s. And this little person over here, this is me. It says, "Stop the war in Iraq." When I was living in Korea from the late 90s and the early 2000s, I also had the chance to be a part of one student LGBT organization at Seoul National University. So since the early to mid 1990s, we've seen the emergence also of student groups, LGBT student groups, which would have been almost impossible before the 1990s. And this is also a picture from another place where I learned a lot about South Korean queer cultures. I was a bartender at a gay bar. And these are some friends who used to hang out in the bar before we opened. So it's just giving you a picture of my kind of intellectual investments. Professor Hong mentioned that I published this book, Queer Korea, which brought together studies in history, in film studies, and anthropology to try to start a debate and a discussion about how queerness can help us not only talk about minority histories that have been buried under other kinds of stories, but also how a queer approach can help us to reevaluate some of the fundamental assumptions we have also about things like South Korea's economic development, its military confrontation with North Korea, and other kinds of processes. I'm currently working with a filmmaker in South Korea, and we've created a documentary which is going to premiere in late August called Paradise. And that documentary traces the history of how gay men used movie theaters as a space to meet one another in an era when gay bars like this, where I worked in the early 2000s, were not yet created. And so, as I'll show you today, gay men made use of spaces that were not designed for them, but which they appropriated and made into their own. So this is just a way of trying to present to you my own history and position. My goal is to create a dialogue and a debate with which Korean scholars and activists and artists based in Korea or based in the US or based elsewhere can enter and can promote on their own. So I see myself as an ally and a supporter of these movements rather than me taking up all of the space when this space should be taken up by many, many others, especially Koreans and LGBT folks with even greater stakes in the issues that I'll be discussing. So I broke my presentation into 3 parts, but first let me just tell you that I'm going to mostly be talking about what happened after the Korean War. The Korean War takes place in the early 50s, but this wasn't the first time where queerness was expressed in the long, long history of the Korean peninsula. So here are just 2 examples I wanted to show you of historical precursors from the period before the 20th century, before Japan colonized Korea in 1910. So this is the pre-colonial period. So over on the left, you can see a really interesting film that was made in 2015 called The Clown and the King. And this particular film took a very, very small excerpt from the royal records about a king who was quite attracted to this court performer and had a same-sex relationship with him. So this film is available and you can watch it and it depicts the history of what was known in the Joseon dynasty as male colors, or namsek. This was the word that was used not only in Korea, but also in Japan and China for same-sex intimacies. You have to remember that the term homosexuality is largely a late 19th and 20th century invention of scientists and other medical professionals. So before the 20th century, we had same-sex acts, but there was no sort of definition that same-sex acts should be correlated to or connected to some stable identity where someone would say, I am gay, and that defines me as such. So there's very different kinds of models for same-sex intimacies, often in the pre-colonial times between people who are of very different status groups, very different age groups, and so they were very much structured in a hierarchical way, which is characteristic of these pre-colonial forms of same-sex sexuality. Here on the right side, you can see a picture. This is from 20 years into the colonial period. This is a famous same-sex suicide that was done by two women who seemed to be in love with one another. One of them was married, and they jumped off of a bridge and committed suicide together. So this is another instance of the way in which same-sex sexuality before the second half of the 20th century had already been emerging in Korean consciousness, as well as in various media. So I show these examples to you just so you get a sense of what comes before what I'm going to talk about. So as I mentioned, my presentation is broken into three parts. The first part, I'm going to talk to you about female-female intimacies, or gynocentric subcultures, women-centered subcultures after what I call the Long Korean War. Officially, the Korean War breaks out in 1950 with Kim Il-sung's invasion of the South. But in fact, there were already, well before 1950, various confrontations between leftist and rightist elements that are going to lead to the outbreak of the international phase of the Korean War in 1950. And the war, although it's going to end unofficially with an armistice, which means that military officials basically decide to cease hostilities, the war is still going on. So that's why I say the Long Korean War. We have to imagine that the ongoing confrontation with North Korea is going to have a very important way in which all of South Korean society is conceived of. So I want you to think of national division in the background as I discuss these subcultures of women. And as you can imagine, because of war, in fact, we have two wars. We have World War II, called the Asia-Pacific War, and we have the Korean War in the span of about 10 or 15 years. So between 1937 and 1953, the Korean Peninsula is engaged in two wars. So we have to keep in the back of our mind war, occupation, and unfortunately death as one feature of the post-Korean War order. So one of the interesting things that I found when I started this project is the remarkable queer, what I call the queer aftermath of the Korean War. In various forms, we see queerness being talked about as an issue in the post-war Korean War era. So this is a materials from 1957, so just after the war is over. And if you read Korean or Chinese characters, you'll see that it says the bride and the groom are both women. And here it says a handsome or cool same-sex wedding ceremony. So I was quite shocked at first to actually find these kinds of materials. What explains both the practice of two women, here you can see getting dressed up for a wedding ceremony, and then why would newspapers and magazines cover these kinds of ceremonies? So it got me to think about the fact that, of course, men had been lost in the war, was very difficult to survive without family members, and it would have been very unusual for women not to be married at this time. So if a woman had, let's say, lost her husband in the war, or maybe a woman had never been married before and couldn't find a partner to cohabit with, it's quite possible that women could cohabit with one another. So whether their relationships were primarily driven by what we would call homosexuality, whether we would say that they partnered because of economic reasons and difficulty of survival, whether it was also some kind of function of other factors, these I think all came to bear on the decisions for women to partner with one another, and also to seek some kind of recognition, social recognition, to solidify their partnerships. So we'll see how they are going to host wedding ceremonies. They won't ask the state for official recognition because it's quite clear that the government is not going to recognize those couples. So it's not a legal arrangement, but it is a social arrangement. They go through wedding ceremony practices, they dress in wedding attire, they invite guests to the wedding, sometimes including their own family members and neighbors, to announce to the rest of the world that we are partnering with one another. So I think we have to actually take this quite seriously to think about why they partnered with each other, why they presented themselves socially in this way, and what their relationships were like. So when I first went to Korea, I told you I went in the late 1990s, and people used to say to me, well, there's no gay people in Korea, or there are no lesbian people in Korea. And I sort of thought, well, that's strange because I'm working at a gay bar, and every weekend I meet gay and lesbian people. So one of the things I'm trying to show is that these kinds of traditions date to a much earlier period in history, not to the 90s or the 2000s. And the other thing I would often hear is that homosexuality is some kind of foreign import, like American soldiers brought it, or American English teachers brought it. We don't have it among Koreans. So in fact, Koreans did have it, and Koreans themselves talked about it. So to me, this is a very important example. I mentioned earlier traditions of same-sex sexuality, and here I just want to mention one term that was often used, and that's millstone couple. So I'll show you that term on this slide, which is from around the same time. And if you read Korean, you'll notice this term, 맷돌 부부. 맷돌 is a grindstone. So it's a tool used to crush grains, so like wheat or rice or something like that. But in the case of Korea, 맷돌 or 맷돌 부부, grindstone couples, was a reference to women who partnered with one another. In fact, the term itself dates back to the Joseon dynasty. Many kings had concubines and other kinds of lovers, and they had to make themselves available to the monarch, but they weren't always at his bedside. So some stories emerged about court women who in fact had same-sex relations with one another while they were living in the court. So that early reference, actually a quite graphic or pornographic reference to women rubbing their genitalia against one another. This is how we get the term 맷돌 부부. And in these articles, you can see here reference to 미망인, so this is widows, and also to other features of the post-war period where women are, as you can see here, coupling with one another. But in the mass media, of course, this isn't quite exactly a quote unquote normal kind of relationship or normal marriage. And so you can see how in this description, they're described as being sort of abnormal, or even like this term means something like deformed. But it gives you a good sense in which these kinds of issues were being raised in the mass media, wondering how many of these kinds of individuals are living in Korea. They tried to estimate them at 4,000 couples, and also some kind of commentary about how they were, in a sense, resisting patriarchal pressures to marry men and to also bear children and carry on the family line. So women partnering with other women, especially if they hadn't been married before and given birth to children, could be considered an important form of resistance against both heterosexuality and patriarchy. Now, as I began to do my research, and I've primarily been using newspapers and also weekly publications. So here you can see some examples from regional newspapers. So I thought at first, when I found these accounts of women getting married to each other, I thought, well, maybe this is just a Seoul phenomenon, or maybe this is just limited to big cities. And then when I started looking in regional newspapers, like the left article is from a newspaper in Busan, and this article is from South Cholla province, so the other side of South Korea, the southwestern side of Korea. And in fact, we find examples of this consistently being reported on in the mass media. So this article says that they've been married for 4 years. One of the partners it says this person has been dressing in masculine attire for 10 years, and they're now married. Over here, this is from the Cheonnam Ilbo, is talking about not only just a marriage, but how lesbian relationships tend to fall apart. And so at the same time that they're talking about these same-sex intimacies, there's also a kind of tone which is quite derogatory, trying to warn women against getting into these kinds of relationships and providing a kind of cautionary tale to avoid these kind of relationships because, as they would say, they seem to fall apart. This is obviously a kind of ideological use of queer lives to try to make some kind of message to put Korean patriarchy back on track after the Korean War is over in 1953. So here's a very typical example of how a couple like this might have been represented. So this is a newspaper article from 1965. It says same-sex married couple, ? Commits thievery together. So a lot of articles about how queer people are essentially criminals and the rest of society needs to be on the lookout for them and to be weary of them. So I think that these kinds of articles make several points. The first is that there did develop out of this war a very kind of intimate and woman-centered subculture that we haven't paid enough attention to. We know, for example, that, theatrical genres were extremely popular among women. And there was one particular genre that was really popular among women. The students in my class are reading about this for this week, and that was called Yosong Gukguk. It was a form of Korean opera and theater performance that was staged only by women. So women played both female roles and male roles, and this was extremely popular among women. So we can imagine that same-sex intimacies were part of a much broader culture in which same-sex intimacies among women, whether romantic, erotic, or just social with women gathering, were extremely important, particularly as the war had left this trauma for all Koreans. And I think women responded to that trauma in different kinds of ways. Now, the mass media is trying to make sense of what appears to them as quite unusual or strange. So when groups of women appear in these pictures, typically with one partner presenting in a masculine way and another person presenting in a feminine way, the mass media try to understand this by calling the masculine presenting partner a husband and the feminine presenting person as wife. Again, this is the way that mainstream culture is trying to make sense of something that's very foreign to them. So these are media terms often imposed upon a subculture that they don't have intimate knowledge of. They try to access through reporting, but they can't quite understand it. And that's why I think that if you read these accounts, I've marked in red here the number of times that question marks are used. Constantly sort of calling into question, well, wait, who's the husband and what does this partner do? Is there relationship truly real? And I think the question mark is a good indication of the kind of doubt that is cast on their relationship. I mentioned to you already that they're often described as being somehow deviant and criminals, and therefore exist as social threats. Particularly the social threat was often described most dramatically from this masculine presenting partner, who in the subcultural terms of the period was known as pajishi. So if you know Korean, paji is pant and shi just means Mr. or Mrs. This is how women referred to each other. Not husband and wife, but pajishi and chimashi. So the person who wore the pants and the person who wore the skirt. So the pajishi partner, this person, was often described as extremely threatening and violent, demonstrating that women who tried to make use of masculinity, their credentials were called into question. So whereas it seemed natural for biological men to be masculine, somehow women who were exercising masculinity, maybe as a way of making money or accessing power, or because they identified more with being male and perhaps were in fact what we would call today transgender, they were seen as being especially threats. So here we can see an example of this extremely masculine presenting person, gender non-conforming person. We might even call this person a trans man. In fact, this particular individual was raised by, I'm going to use the pronoun his or their family as a son. Korean families, of course, preferred sons. And sometimes if they didn't get a son, they would raise a female-born daughter as a son. Or in the context of the war, it might have been that this person, for example, lost a brother in the war. And there was no way for the family to survive economically, especially if mom and dad were ill or couldn't work. And so to earn a wage, it was much more advantageous to be a man because the labor market and pay scales were skewed in favor of men. So some women present as men and try to take up masculine or male-dominated jobs simply to earn a wage. This particular person, as I mentioned, was raised as a man and so worked in a factory. And then sometime while this person was socializing with fellow coworkers, was outed as a woman. And then this becomes kind of sensational fodder for what's presented in the mass media, again, as a kind of warning to people to follow certain kinds of norms, gender norms and sexual norms. So the fact that this person was female-bodied, but was raised as a man and wanted to partner with a woman created a kind of double stigma. The fact that this was a masculine presenting woman and that this biological woman was attracted to women and wanted to marry women was presented as some kind of abnormal sense of self. And yet women, for their part, as we see in many articles, continue to not only partner with one another, but also to hold these wedding ceremonies. So here is an example from 1965. You'll notice that many of the articles will describe the wedding as the first time. In fact, if we go back earlier, we saw that this happened at least from 1957, but was presented in 1965 as if it was the first wedding. You can see, again, the kind of attire that the two partners are wearing at the wedding ceremony. Some people would describe this as some kind of heterosexual mimicry, where women are mimicking male and female or masculine and feminine attire. I think that's a ungenerous reading of what women were doing. You have to remember that there were very few gender styles that women could adopt beyond feminine and masculine. And it would have been highly unusual for women, especially at a wedding ceremony, for both women to wear hanbok dresses, or for both women to present in this kind of masculine way by wearing a suit and a tie. So the way I understand this is, on the one hand, they seem to be conforming to conventions of dress, and yet in their relationships, they're using the patriarchal system that is available to them and recrafting or taking pieces of the patriarchal system and creating something new in their relationships. And so we can read and see these kinds of relationships all throughout the authoritarian period. You'll notice if you read Korean, this says South Korea's first same-sex wedding ceremony. This is from 1970. And you say to yourself, wait a minute, I thought 1965 was South Korea's first wedding ceremony. So you have to understand where these kinds of stories were published. They were published in these kinds of weekly magazines that were extremely popular as entertainment during the authoritarian period, along with films. And these kind of magazines come out every week. It's like Time magazine. So people are reading this in a very quick way, and then they dispose of the magazine and then are presented with a new one. So we have to think then of same-sex stories about women getting married as being almost disposable, that people would read them and almost kind of like forget about them. And so every time there was a new one, the media would be presenting it as if it was the first time, as if gay and lesbian people have no history, that the history is always new rather than being old. That's a way, in a sense, of denying queer people their own traditions and their own history. And so by resurrecting a long history of same-sex intimacies, I think we can counter that myth that this was the first time for a wedding ceremony. I noticed, I mentioned to you earlier the kind of style that these couples presented. So Pajishi on the left and Chimashi on the right. So this looks like a wedding picture that they took. And it's very curious to think about how the reporters got access to, or how they even found out that there was going to be a same-sex ceremony. Did the journalists go to the wedding ceremony like a paparazzi and shoot the picture? Did they ask the couples for the pictures and they gave it to the journalists and printed it, which would suggest some level of consent? Seems like that's the case here, because here we see an image of the two women. It looks like in their home, like reading a magazine. This looks like they're bedding up here. And you'll notice that in this picture, their gender presentation is not nearly as dichotomous as the wedding picture. So this is why I told you that in the wedding, a very formal ceremony, this is probably the only way that women and men, or women and women, or men and men, if they had ceremonies, could present themselves to their friends and their neighbors. But in their personal relations and private spheres, their sense of gender and their roles with each other were not something that we can just capture by saying wife and husband or groom and bride. And if you want to know more, you can read my Queer Korea chapter in which I try to go over these histories. This is a really unique account, and I put it up here just as an example of a woman who participated in a wedding ceremony and who wrote her own account of her own history of dating and having a wedding ceremony with another woman. So whereas most accounts are written by outsiders, journalists or doctors or police officers, objectifying and publicizing these private details, sometimes probably to the chagrin of the people who were involved, here's an instance of someone who wrote her own story, and is quite interesting because the title of this account is "Stop Asking About Our Sexual Life." So as you can imagine, these accounts were very much directed at the erotic energies of heterosexual men who are reading stories about lesbian women. So in doing so, heterosexual men can confirm their own sense of normalcy because they're heterosexual. And even if they're the working class people who in the 60s and the 70s are underpaid, they can't organize labor protests, they have a very difficult life. This is a kind of outlet for them to express their maybe their dissatisfaction, express their erotic interests by projecting that onto lesbian women. So here's a really interesting example about a woman who is involved in one of these relationships who is talking back to power and saying, stop objectifying us. Some other images, this is from the 1970 ceremony, 71 ceremony. And again, you can see how women are going either to Buddhist temples, wedding halls. We have some accounts even of Christian churches where women get a religious officiant to oversee their wedding. And also in Korean tradition to have a janchi, to have a big feast after the wedding. So it shows us that these female same-sex relationships, although objectified by the mass media, the neighbors probably thought they were a little strange. But in fact, there was some place within South Korean society to accommodate this practice. After all, friends and family members are being invited to these parties. So here we can see also the newlyweds, Pajishi and Chimashi, taking one of the mothers out on a trip together. Also shows you that perhaps in this case, the mother gave her blessing for the ceremony, even though she knew that the partner of her daughter was in fact another woman. And some other really interesting visual materials I found. Typically the Pajishi was in charge of like very laborious tasks. So here the Pajishi is moving snow, etc., etc. And just to go back to the earlier point about how each new same-sex marriage had to be presented as if it was a first. So in 1973, there was an article about yet another ceremony, and instead of using a picture from 1973, they used a picture from 1970 and sort of just recycled it, which I find quite interesting in terms of how to analyze visual culture. So here are some other ceremonies, one from 1974 in which the pictures from the 70 ceremony are recycled and rehashed. And again, you see this constant sort of spurious claim that it was Korea's first same-sex wedding. In fact, this was happening all over the place. I also found indications that women who wedded one another symbolically often created their own kind of queer families. We know that South Korea was undergoing a family planning campaign during the 60s and 70s to limit births. We also know that many Korean children were taken away from Korea and sent to places like the US and Europe to be adopted. Those are international or transracial adoptions. Here's examples of domestic adoptions where women would go to an orphanage, or sometimes neighbors would also ask these women if they could help raise a child biologically produced by another couple. So this also indicates to me that neighbors knew about these kinds of women and entrusted them enough with their own children to say, would you raise my child? I'm not wealthy enough to raise 6 children. You all don't have any children. How about you adopt a child? This is quite remarkable, actually, for this earlier period. And some other pictures, these ones I show you just because they're clearer. This is from the 1980s. Here you can see the looks like the inside of a Buddhist temple. You can see a monk with a bald head and 2 women getting married. And then I also show this picture to show you that these ceremonies were not held in total privacy, but it looks like mostly women were invited, but probably also family members. And it's hard to see because I blacked out this guy, but he's smiling, looking on as these 2 women are getting married. So let me move on now to talk about the gay histories. And here I'll speak more specifically about how urban space was incredibly important. So we need to look to understand gay homosociality, we need to look at tea rooms, theaters, bars, and other places where gay men would have interacted with one another. We can learn about the history of gay men through similar kinds of sources. This is a 1965 expose, really interesting account about different kinds of gay men, where they hang out in Seoul. So there's a whole section on theaters, and you can see how a picture here of how gay men go to theaters not to watch movies, but to find one another and to have boyfriends or sexual partners. Also how tea rooms, which were extremely popular in the 60s and 70s, even though they weren't designed for gay men went there and were able to make the tea rooms part of their subculture of gayness, often under the radar, where journalists and others can't quite find them, and yet the mass media is trying to track them down and to write about them. So in these accounts, they mention certain kinds of theaters. So it's interesting because they don't want to totally mention the theater. So they'll often say things like, well, if you go to the D theater in Myeongdong, you can find a lot of gay men. Well, there's not really that many places that start with D and are a theater in Myeongdong. So this is the, sorry, I spelled this wrong. This should say the Donghwa Theater. You can see the Chinese characters here. Often many department stores in South Korea had theaters up on the top floor. So gay men would go to this theater and would cruise one another. So this is what is today the Lotte-young Plaza, which is located in Myeongdong. So even as the articles, in a sense, were criticizing and talking about this as a social phenomena that Koreans needed to know about, at the same time, in an era when South Koreans didn't have the internet, didn't have smartphones, didn't have GPS technology, these printed publications were one of the few ways that gay men could find out about the existence of other gay men. So if you read in this account, in Myeongdong at the D Theater, you can find other gay men. If you were a gay man, you would have gone to Myeongdong and just walked around and found out what was a theater that started with the letter D. Other places were similar. This is up in Chongno, the old commercial thoroughfare of Seoul. And this is Hwashin department store, where there was also a famous theater where gay men used to cruise. This is located right here, not far from Gwanghwamun and Gyeongbok Palace, so right in the center of the city of Seoul. So one of the other things I've been doing is to interview older gay and lesbian and transgender people to supplement what I'm reading about in the archive. So I just give you an brief account here of one of the individuals I spoke with. I'll call him Mr. C, born in 1949, right before the Korean War breaks out, is a college student in the late 60s, goes to this tea room. This is extremely popular tea room in Myeongdong called Shimji. And when he went to Myeongdong, he found this group of fashion designers, male fashion designers, who in the Myeongdong area, this is the cultural center of Seoul, used to be where Japanese settlers lived during the colonial period, learned about these male fashion designers who were themselves gay, knew that he had same-sex attractions, and found out by word of mouth that if he went up to Hwashin department store, he could find other gay men. So this is how he began his career, by going to tea rooms and to department stores in order to meet other men. By the 1970s, we can see how these places not only appear in the South Korean mass media. So here is an account that says that some homosexual frenzy is coming to South Korea. This is often described as like the waves of the sexual revolution that are beginning in San Francisco are somehow making their way to Korea. Again, a story of how homosexuality comes to Korea from the outside. It's never something that Koreans have themselves. Well, in fact, Koreans were cruising at theaters from a very early period. We also begin to see that Koreans are meeting other kinds of people besides just Koreans. So if we look, for example, at these Japanese publications from the 1970s, it was encouraging gay men, Japanese men, to travel to Seoul. And if they go to Chongno area, or if they go to the Huaxin department store, they can find gay men to meet. So we're seeing, in fact, that the gay subculture of South Korea was already global and transnational, well before K-pop comes. This is another interesting set of materials that I show you that describe how certain hotels were known to be places where gay men could go to meet locals. So if you look at American and European gay magazines from the 1970s, you'll find information about places like the Savoy Hotel, where if you went into the lobby, you could often meet a Korean local who would be willing to go out on a date with you or maybe have sex with you. We also learn, I think this is a bit of a hyperbole, saying that every bellboy in Korea is a pimp. That's probably not the case, but there were certainly some bellboys who function as this kind of broker for introducing foreign people to Koreans. This was the most famous of the cruising theaters. This is Pagoda Theater, which was in the middle of Cheongno. And this is just a quote from somebody I interviewed who told me about what Cheongno cruising theaters were like. And I'll just read this quote because I think it's really interesting. He said, "We were there enjoying a movie when we noticed that others were standing in the back near the projection room. Even though there were lots of empty seats, I wondered why. And to my surprise, they were having sex. They were in the back behind the projection booth, kissing in the dark. Except it was not that dark. The back of the theater was structured such that there was enough space to stand underneath the projection booth. I sneaked a glance at them and saw them kissing, giving each other blowjobs, and even having anal sex. I was so shocked. But at the exact moment, I discovered a new and wondrous world. That place lingered in my head, provoking sensual thoughts even when I was studying. And since then, I could not stop thinking about Pagoda Theater in Cheongno. I had some time to spare before I returned to college after my release from military service. So I learned more about Pagoda and about the world-famous gay bars that grace the area. Once I discovered Cheongno, I lost interest in everything else. Cheongno was a sight to behold." Nikki, how am I doing on time? Do you want me to wrap up or?
We have plenty of time. We're at 4:27 right now, but we started about 10 minutes after, around 3:40. So
okay, let me just try to finish as quickly as I can. This is the last section, and then I'll wrap up. So I've gone over the history of female-female relations, particularly as regards cohabiting and having wedding ceremonies. I've talked about how gay men used public spaces not designed for them, but which they appropriated and made into their own in order to create gay subcultures. Now let me talk about some histories of gender non-conforming people, especially transgender women, and also intersex histories. So people who are born with sexual characteristics that couldn't easily be only described as being male or being female. So one person I'd like to introduce you to here, and who I have permission to use her name and to show you her picture as an example of a gender non-conforming person. This is Sekja, who you can see here on the right. You'll see when I interviewed her last year and asked her about how she wanted to be presented, she told me that she didn't mind at all me sharing her story. She was proud of her story. She had some ups and downs in her life, but she says, don't use any kind of fake name. Just tell them it's me, it's Sekja. So here you can see a picture of Sekja. She was in a performance that featured several elderly South Koreans. Here you can see gender non-conforming women, masculine women or trans masculine identified women, and a transgender woman. This is Sekja, whose story I want to present to you right now. So I interviewed several people. I have to cover their faces just because I can't reveal their identities. But what I quickly realized is that this term queer fugitivity really fits well with their experiences. So many of them had to leave home. They were rejected by their parents. They were bullied at school. They were made fun of by neighbors simply because they were born male and presented as women or presented as feminine. So when I talked to Sekja, she even said to me, we don't have to talk about school, do we? Suggested to me that she had really painful and even maybe traumatic memories about her period in school. And so I quickly didn't ask her too much about that, but others told me about how they were from a young age bullied at school and therefore became very introverted. Many of them left home. Another woman I talked to, transgender woman, told me that her older brother used to beat her up when she put on her Korean mother's dresses or tied these kind of scarves around her head. So many of them eventually end up leaving home and creating communities among themselves where they're essentially living and working on the street and find one another, often in movie theaters. So here's a picture of Sekja before she transitioned. This is from the 1980s when she was working in restaurants and bars. And she described herself as a fairy. This is my translation of the term gisuni, which is often used to describe effeminate gay men. But in her case, fairy meant something more like gender non-conforming, closer to transgender the way we might use it today. She said that in the early 70s, she went to Pagoda Theater by pure accident, and some random man started touching her body, and men were giving each other strange looks. They were all standing in the back, coming and going, so I intuitively understood that this place was for my kind of people. In fact, many gay and transgender people refer to these kind of theaters as salons. Gives you a sense of how they weren't necessarily there for the movies, but they were there for meeting other people. And these movie theaters were special because you could buy a ticket, one ticket, often very inexpensive, like the equivalent of maybe 50 cents US money, and you could spend the whole day there. And the movie would be projected over and over and over again. So it was a great place to meet others. So Sekja said, you know, I went to Pagoda Theater very often. From there, we slept with whomever we liked. Because we were younger, the older men used to often pay us for sex, and we used that money to pay for our rent and buy food. So this was the beginning of my life, she says, in Chongno. So Chongno, you can understand, is a very important hub of gay and gender non-conforming subcultures. So she says, my friend and I were living at an inn when we bought some clothes at the local market. This is the 70s, so bell bottoms were in at the time. We flaunted those bell bottoms, strutted along Chongno with our hair long, which would have been a violation in the 1970s because under Pak Jong-il laws, if you were a biological man and you had hair that went over your ears, you could be convicted of a misdemeanor offense. So that you were a biological man and wore your hair long and were wearing blouses and pads to enhance your breast size. This is quite amazing, actually. This is also a period when transgender people can't get gender reaffirming surgery. They can't go to hospitals and get hormones. They can't have gender reassignment surgery. So to self-feminize through their hairstyle, makeup, and clothing is the best way that they can present themselves as men. As women. One of the places that Sekja goes to is a place called Ulchiro, which is pretty unknown today as a gay center, but at the time it was a very important place where a number of exclusive gay male bars were beginning to pop up in the late 70s. So the theaters and the tea rooms, not designed for gay men, but gay men use them. Now we get the emergence of gay bars that are what we would call a gay bar today. Basically, if you're not gay, you're not particularly welcome inside. So I've also interviewed some older gay men who went to these places in Ulchiro. I mentioned that the bars were quite cosmopolitan this time. There were, of course, many American service men and women who were stationed in South Korea. So if they were gay, they might be going to these bars. Again, you can see here an image from one of the gay travel magazines called Spartacus, telling you exactly where to find this gay bar, Adam. This is a bar that many of these friends used to go to. These people were attracted to white men. Today, we tend to use this term potato queen. They identified as Koreans who were primarily attracted to Westerners. And so Adam was one place where they could go, where they could meet foreign men. Some of them eventually partnered with these men and moved overseas to places like Australia and the Netherlands and other places. This is where Sekja ended up working in one of these bars called Hanmaum. And she described the environment like this. She said, well, you know, I liked the fact that I could work as a fairy, an effeminate gay man, but most of the people who went to the bar liked heterosexual like men, people who were quote unquote straight acting. She said most gay folks have the hearts of women inside, so they prefer people who are different. But the guys working at the bars were all masculine types, so customers were naturally attracted to them. So although Sekja could make some money by working there, she couldn't necessarily find a boyfriend or even feel comfortable being a gender non-conforming person. So she quickly moves to another area, another bar in the same area in Ulchiro called Itaewon, which was one of the first bars in Seoul where they actually had drag performances. So she said of Itaewon, customers didn't come there to meet men. They were there to see men wearing dresses and makeup. They were there for the show, and they did not like men who dressed in men's attire. They were there to enjoy the company of men in makeup. So this is really the beginning of Sekja's career and her transition from being an effeminate gay man who uses the theater to get a job in a gay bar to eventually transition to becoming a transgender woman. So this is the final point I want to make about the importance of Itaewon. Many people today know Itaewon primarily as a place where there are gay bars. People tend to go there clubbing, but it has a much earlier history of sex work. Typically sex work that is done by lower class women who sell their bodies to American GIs. So here we can see an early image of what some of those places might have looked like, where American soldiers went to have sex with South Korean women. What is lesser known is that some male-born people who identified as feminine or as women were also working as sex workers in and around Itaewon. So here are a couple of pictures I found, again, from media presentations that coincided with arrests, because presenting yourself as female or feminine at the time was officially a misdemeanor offense. So they were caught by the police and outed to the mass media. And here we can see a picture. It says, 나는 양성이다, 그리고 양공주입니다. So it says, I'm an intersex person and I'm a quote unquote Western princess. The name that was derogatorily given to Koreans who slept with American men. So Itaewon and other camp towns then were not only heterosexual sex work spaces, but also a place where gender non-conforming and intersex people also used to hang out. So the fact that in the 1980s, transgender bars emerge in Itaewon makes a lot of sense. Up until the 1980s, many of these people had been working on the streets. And now by the 1980s, they find more permanent employment in these transgender bars. This is a quite famous man whose name I can use and picture I can show. He was one of these fashion designers in Myeongdong who brought his talents in clothing. He brought his other cultural talents to bear and created these Las Vegas style drag shows at Itaewon transgender bars. So here is the same person you see on the left. He also owned a discotheque and he owned a Japanese restaurant. Here you can see him dressed as a woman and on stage next to Sekja, ready for a performance that was extremely popular in the 1980s. So here you can see a few images of the kind of package shows that they presented. These really elaborate stage performances, partly drawn from sort of kang dancing that was popular in France. They went all over the world to find music and performance. They had choreographers. This is Sekja, you can see performing on the stage. And you can imagine must have given them a real sense of comfort in the sense that they had finally found their own subcultural community and had permanent jobs. But this was also the era in which HIV and AIDS came to South Korea. So just as the 1980s transgender bars were getting started, and people like Sekja were expressing, wow, by the 80s, I finally found my place. I finally feel like I'm at home. Then HIV hit South Korea, and people who were in the sex industry, and of course, gay men and transgender people were especially targeted. So Sekja and others said, you know, it was like living in a sorority. We often lived and cooked and slept in the bar. And so you can imagine the kind of sense of camaraderie that they would have established. And then AIDS comes. So this is a quote from the owner of the transgender bar. It says, South Korean society considered female dressed men as beasts. When AIDS became a social issue in the 80s, they were evicted from their homes. They were also rejected at restaurants. In response, I purchased a 1,700 square foot apartment in Itaewon for them to live in. Since it was the apartment complex where only foreigners resided, 20 of them, that is my workers, could live there safely. That was the situation of transgender people at the time. So I mentioned there's other kinds of struggles that transgender women had to face, and that was the everyday policing. I mentioned to you that male-born people, because they couldn't legally transition, were legally recognized as men. And so often police would come into these transgender bars and would arrest people, send them to detention, make them pay money, and generally, you know, embarrass them not only in the face of public, but also in the face of their friends. So we can begin to see something interesting emerge, which is a kind of sense of politics. Now, this is, again, before the democratic transition, and yet they're political statements. So this one, even though we live among pointed fingers and contempt, I honestly want to contribute and help to society if circumstances allow. Because we have artistic talents, I hope to console the elderly in nursing homes and stage performances for the young at orphanages. So here you can see a member of a transgender club visiting a nursing home and putting on a drag show for these elderly women. They say, I also have a desire to visit detention centers and volunteer for those there who appreciate and understand us. Until now, it has been difficult for us to survive while avoiding the discrimination of others. But from today, we want to live as human beings. Another person says, this is also from the 80s. In the US, one major has emerged with gay liberation as an election pledge. Even if one can't hope for the same thing in Korea, it would be good to guarantee our right of survival. I must establish a barrier or a wall or some kind of way to protect the people who I work with. There is sorokdo for patients suffering from Hansen's disease in Korea. But even the creation of Itaewon as a similar kind of refuge for transgender people, he says, is very far off. And other sort of gestures, political gestures that show both kind of government oppression and the efforts of these transgender women to create their own kind of small scale activism, even if they don't create organizations or even if they don't protest the government. We can see that they're extremely political in their outlook, even as they're trying to earn a living. And this is the last slide I want to show. I mentioned earlier to you the difficulty that transgender women faced in trying to transition. So not only could they not legally transition, but they couldn't medically transition. And yet their desire to be women was so deep that they often would see quack doctors for castration procedures, or they would go to pharmacies where it was possible to buy black market hormones in order to grow their breasts. So Sekja quite sort of glowingly showed me her breasts and said, you know, I took these hormone shots and this is how I have these natural breasts, but other people used to inject silicone or paraffin, substances that are actually quite dangerous and can cause all kinds of health risks. Other kinds of quotes from her told me about the kinds of surgeries that they would get, often from quack doctors. You know, these kinds of surgeries are not supposed to be performed outside of hospitals, but it shows you the extent that transgender women went to transition and to put pressure on their own society, on their own legal system, and on the medical system to be able to be recognized in an official way. And this is all before the 1990s. This is all before Korea transitions to democracy. Last slide I just wanted to show you to bring us up to the present. This is me hanging out with some of the elderly transgender women who were generous enough to spend their time with me and to show you some of the ongoing challenges that they faced. During COVID, their bars, as you can imagine, were closed because you couldn't go there because the government didn't want people to spread COVID. And so they were quite downtrodden, didn't have money. How are they going to survive? So one of the ways they did this, they bought many outfits over the years to dress up and to do these stage performances. Here they created a bazaar in Itaewon, and they were selling their clothes in order to make money. So this is an example of the kinds of solidarities that transgender, gay, and lesbian people created in the face of quite a lot of oppression and difficulties in promoting their interests. And I hope gives you a greater sense of where Korea has come from, as today, now there is a state where transgender, gay, and lesbian people can go to and protest for their rights. Not all of their appeals are being listened to, but of course that has changed. And of course, the media and the representation of LGBT people is rapidly changing from one where outsiders were largely trying to control by having knowledge about queer subcultures, to a moment now where gay, lesbian, trans, intersex people are telling their own stories in their own voices without others having to mediate and to warp their experiences. So I think that's where I should stop, and I'm happy to take your questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you for the enlightening lecture, Professor Todd Henry. I've you know, I set it up so that now you may, if the participants may unmute themselves if you have questions. Anybody has comments or questions for Professor Henry?
Feel free to ask anything related to the presentation or unrelated.
You can unmute yourself or raise your hand. Don't be shy. Anyone?
I think I have a question. I'm forming it in my head right now, but I've been following K-pop for many years as a fan, and there's like elements where especially in boy bands, but also girl groups, will hint at like almost kiss, or sometimes they kiss or they hold hands, and it's almost like they can't express that they are actually gay, but there's two men kissing or two women kissing, and it seems like there's a tension between fans actually wanting to see this behavior, but you can't actually express it. So what is the state of acceptance right now?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm no expert on K-pop. Others are probably much more informed than I am, but the way I understand those kinds of expressions are, and I'm sorry to be very pessimistic, about this kind of thing, but my own personal understanding of this, of course, people can do with messages what they want. So this is one point I was trying to make also about the earlier media, even accounts that were extremely derogatory, pathological, really. I mean, difficult for us to read from this perspective now that we have, where we have much greater freedom and much greater representation. It's almost hard to go back to the 50s, 60s, and 70s and read these accounts. And the first impulse is to say, oh, that's terrible. Why did they treat them like that? But then at the same time, you have to think about what I call shadow readers, people who, despite the fact that the media is not made for you or it's not specifically targeting you as a population, you can appropriate that. You can sit in the shadows and use that for your own purposes. So the same account that was telling Koreans, oh, there's these perverted gay men who use theaters to find each other, that was like a guide for gay men to go to places to find each other. So at the same time they're criticizing it, they're giving a template or giving this information to people to use in order to find the theaters. So every gay man, older gay man I talked to, I said, how did you find out about the gay theaters? Weekly publications. So that's why weeklies are really important, because they have, these multiple meetings. So to go back to your question about K-pop, I don't think most K-pop is designed for queer people. Holland is an exception. Holland left his band and is now making music independently. I hear that he has a greater following among non-Koreans outside of Korea than he does in Korea. He makes specifically LGBT focused music videos where like gay men are kissing and there's drag queens and all kinds of other people. So for me, what K-pop is doing is it realizes that it has a lot of communities and constituencies, and gay and lesbian is one constituency. So it can appeal to that constituency. But as you mentioned, it can't appeal too far. So there is a sense that like the same-sex relationships or same-sex intimacies are kind of like fantasy, or it only goes so far and then it kind of stops. So to me, that's a kind of, again, in a kind of pessimistic and in industry reading of K-pop, a very smart way to make money. If you can add LGBT as a constituency, consumer constituency, just as if you can add Mexicans who love K-pop as a constituency, you'll see that some groups, for example, like sing in Spanish. What's the group, the K-pop star whose dog bit somebody and she died?
It's Super Junior and the member is Itaewon.
Itaewon. So Super Junior, they have these music videos where they're like half singing in Spanish and like they're doing like bachata with K-pop. That's a perfect example of what I'm talking about. It's a kind of appeal to another kind of constituency, in this case, Spanish speaking and people who are familiar more with like Latin rhythms. So I kind of see K-pop in that sense as appealing to a kind of constituency. They kind of play around with gender, but then when push comes to shove, they don't fully take that kind of like radically LGBT or even queer position. And even the K-pop stars themselves, they can't even really speak on these topics because they're afraid of alienating some other fans. So I asked Super Junior, because I had a chance to meet him. What was his name?
Itaewon.
Itaewon. I asked him specifically, and he gave like the most diplomatic, like non-answer, about how he stands or what he thinks about political issues. And I think that's precisely because he doesn't want to alienate anybody. So I guess that's to say that K-pop, yes, can play around with queerness and it kind of can package what it sells through queerness, but they can't go too far. And that shadow readers are going to read into what K-pop is doing stylistically or with music in the way they want. So, and I should mention, there are other bands in which like the men are doing like sissy dances or the women are cutting their hair short and presenting in this kind of very masculine way. So it is possible, but I think there's a lot of market pressures because we all know that K-pop is very choreographed. There's a lot of market pressures to limit those expressions in ways that maybe if you didn't have to please everybody or please a certain kind of constituency, maybe it could be even more radical, and maybe like K-pop stars could actually say what they thought. So that's what
I find it interesting that you brought Siwon up specifically, because that's who I thought in my head of. Lee O mentioned in the comments about fan service.
Yeah.
And very specifically, Siwon and another member of his group like kissed a lot back in the day as fan service, but also Siwon is known as very religious and Christian. And so that's kind of like, it also adds tension. Yeah, I do agree with Lee that it feels like fan service most of the time. But there's also a lot of members of boy bands and girl groups that like really teeter on the edge of either like a feminine expression if you're male or more masculine expression if you're female, and like it just goes to the edge without actually saying they're gay. But also there's a lot of fans writing story, I forgot what they're called, but they're stories that involve like same-sex couples. So like fans are writing a
fan fiction.
Thank you, fan fiction. They're writing about like histories of same-sex members being in relationships. So it's like, it seems like people want to see it, but you can't actually express that with definite terms.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with fan service. I mean, it's highly choreographed. I mean, everything and highly manicured. You know, the skin tone, the six-pack, the, you know, showing the midriff, you know, the hugging, the kissing. I'm not saying that they're robots, but yeah, you have to understand that it's always a kind of appeal to fandom. So in that sense, I think that it's directed in that way. So I guess I'm more interested in what people do with K-pop than actually the content of K-pop. So that, you know, all male bands or dancing groups take like girls' songs and do like femme cover dancing as like a rendition of something else. Like to me, that's showing as a kind of shadow reading or secondary production, what are the videos where the fans take pictures of themselves while they're consuming K-pop? Reaction videos?
Fan cam, well, reaction, but you have fan cam focused on specific members sometimes.
Again, I think that's the most fascinating part. And I don't study that, but like people like Michelle Cho at the University of Toronto study that. I think we need more people to study how fans are appropriating K-pop, even if it's not like mostly designed for them as an LGBT constituency, how they make use of it, or what kinds of people are iconic and popular. Like we have our own, from my generation, right, queer icons that gay men love. You go to the club and everybody is dancing Madonna or, you know, Lady Gaga. So those kinds of queer icons also deserve, I think, treatment. But you're asking the wrong person because I'm not a K-pop expert.
I learned a lot today, Professor. Like so informative. I didn't know most or any of this. So thank you very much.
Sure thing.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Don't be shy.
Don't be shy. Anyone else? Maybe one more question and we'll close.
Have you encountered other? Oh, can you hear me?
Yes, can hear you.
While you're doing this research, have you encountered other people doing similar research, or are you the only one?
For Korea or for other places?
For Korea.
So as you might know, queer studies in Korea is not institutionalized. as it is here, where we have LGBT programs or critical gender studies programs where you can major or minor. So it's quite difficult because to do the research, you need time and money. So if you're a grad student, for example, you could theoretically do it, but the problem is that it's very difficult to get a job in Korea if you write a master's thesis or especially a dissertation on queer studies, because many universities and many departments are still, if not hostile towards the topic, they say, well, why is this important? You know, you're only talking about like a small percentage of people. This is typical reaction. So, you know, you're doing a minority study. So this seems less important than like some other topic. Or advisors might tell their own students, you know, I've heard, for example, even feminist scholars who are primarily trying to do research to deconstruct male power will say to a female student who wants to do work on lesbian issues, will say, that's not the proper subject of feminism because we're trying to fight male domination. So to write about women in a kind of divisive way, where there's, you know, biological women and there's transgender women and there's other kinds of women, like that's somehow not the right topic to study. So a lot of students get discouraged from doing this kind of research. And then finding the archival materials takes a lot of time. So more people are studying post-1990 phenomena because it's easier to access, but doing things before 1990, like on the colonial period, or God forbid, like the Choson dynasty period or the Goryeo period, that's even more challenging in terms of finding materials. So there's obstacles. So my goal is, as a non-Korean outsider, to somehow open up a space so that it's possible to do this work. It's possible to write studies, to publish, should be possible to get a job. And you should be able to do that if you're Korean and you live in Korea. So that's my activism, is to try to make that possible. And then I can just disappear. Korea won't need me anymore as somebody, you know, to help. So to me, that's how I would use my privilege or my access to, you know, some kind of platform. Like this is a platform for me to speak. I would much rather have a Korea-based person telling a Korean audience about this topic. So until that happens, I won't rest. There's a couple though. I know one PhD student, but he told me that his advisor told him that if he wrote this dissertation, that he probably couldn't get a job. So he switched his topic. And that's really sad. Or sometimes students will go overseas. They'll come to the US or go to the UK and do their research there, maybe because it's easier. They get better advice. And then there's the problem of outing. So if you do LGBT studies, then people just assume that you're gay or lesbian or trans. And if that can create harm and make it difficult for you to survive, then maybe people kind of keep that hidden, which is also unfortunate.
Thank you. This lecture has been recorded, and I will send it out to, I'll share it with Professor Henry, as well as, you know, if you're at LACC, I will send out an email to all faculty lists, or you can also email me. I'm going to put in the chat. My email address is very easy to remember. It's Hong, MJ, just like my last name, and then M for Mickey, J, my middle initial, at laccd.edu. And I will provide the event recording link if you email me. Thank you so much, Professor Henry, and all of you for staying for the Q&A and the rest of the talk. Thank you, everybody. We conclude this lecture now. Take care, everybody. Thank you, Professor Henry.
All my pleasure.
It was wonderful
Thank you,
to have
Professor.
you.
Thank
Take
you,
care,
everybody, for
everyone.
attending.
Thank you.
Nikki, I'll stay around if you want for a minute.